Just 1 second, I'll be back.
Okay, sir.
1 second, I'll be back.
Yes, I think we can start.
Sure.
Good afternoon. I welcome all the attendees present here to the Nobelium 2020, which is a series of talks about the Nobel Prizes awarded this year in their respective fields. Well, it's always good to start with peace, isn't it? Our first talk is about the Nobel Peace Prize 2020 by Dr. Ahmed Rajesh. The Nobel Peace Prize 2020 was awarded to World Food Programme WFP for its efforts to combat hunger, for its contribution to bettering conditions for peace in conflict affected areas, and for acting as a driving force in efforts to prevent the use of hunger as a weapon of war and conflict. It's my honor to introduce our speaker. Dr. Aman Rajesh completed his master's degree in Ancient Indian History at the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi in 1992 and proceeded to pursue an MPhil in History from the same department and worked on the socio-religious context of the early Chola temples in 1994. He worked for his PhD degree on the Buddhist monasteries of Tibet at the Center for Central Asian Studies, School of International Studies JNU, and was awarded the degree in 1999. He is presently working as an assistant professor in history at the Department of History, University of Hyderabad. His main areas of research include the history of Tibet and religious movements in medieval South India and international affairs related to Central Asia. His publications include the Buddhist monastery, Himalayan Buddhist monasteries, and several others. If there are any questions during the talk, kindly drop it in the chat box and they will be addressed at the end. Now, I would like to invite our honorable speaker, Dr. Ahmed Rajesh, to continue.
Yeah, thank you for your kind words, Manaswita, and members of the Junior Science Club and Entropy Club, that is a Senior Science Club. I'm very happy that you have brought out this series Nobelium 2020, and I'm equally happy that the first talk is on the Peace Prize. So generally what happens in the Nobel award ceremony is that the Peace Prize is seen as something which is an add-on prize, but and this is the only area in which, apart from economics and literature, that social sciences gets represented in. But anyway, peace and this whole peace prize has received a boost after the 1980s and the 90s, when the Dalai Lama was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, in which if you see a galaxy of leaders, all of them wearing three-piece suits, and then you have only two people among the larger group of diplomats. That is, one is the Dalai Lama wearing his traditional red robes, and one is Nelson Mandela wearing his colorful shirt. So these two people stood apart from the rest of the gathering. So when asked by some journalists, they said that it was an unconventional thinking. Such type of unconventional thinking is reflected in the World Food Programme's effort, when people thought only of hunger as something which can fill the stomachs. As you had rightly pointed out in the introduction, that is the mandate of the United Nations when they spelled out the World Food Programme that was begun, that the links with hunger and also with war. And this was truly echoed by the Nobel Committee, when the Nobel Committee said that while awarding this peace prize, that the peace prize is awarded to the World Food Programme not only for, that is for bettering conditions for peace in conflict, that not only is my emphasis, and peace in conflict affected areas, and for acting as a driving force in efforts to prevent the use of hunger as a weapon of war and conflict. So we see that this whole idea of hunger, that is many areas which are battle scarred, and there are so many places in the world. Actually, after World War II, we have only 21 days of peace in the world. That is, World War II officially ended in 1945, and from 1945 till 2020, there are some or the other conflagrations going on in some parts of the world. Maybe it's in North Korea, some parts of Africa, Latin America. Keeping this in mind, in 1961, Dwight Eisenhower, who was the President of the United States of America, pondered on this problem of the link between war and hunger, and also between natural calamities. And then he started this World Food Programme. This was given a chance of only 3 years. So there was a lot of opposition. Actually, the United Nations started in 1945 after the World War II, but the United States could not join the earlier incarnation, that is the League of Nations, because of opposition from the Congress in the United States. So they said that anything to do with United Nations, we have to move very cautiously. But when it was started, immediately after that, what happens is that it becomes a part of the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. Then we have natural calamities. The first two natural calamities, one was the man-made calamity, that was the relocation of the Aswan Dam. Actually, when the Aswan Dam was built, you had large number of archaeological sites to be relocated. So UNESCO stepped in, and then you had some major sites like the Sphinx and all being relocated. But then you also had large number of people there. These are the Nubians, who are a minority ethnic group in Egypt, who are one of the earliest peoples in Africa. So the Nubians had to be relocated to some parts of Egypt and South Sudan. And then these people who were prosperous farmers, suddenly after the dam was built, found themselves to be hungry. And it led to some level of tension, which would have actually led to war. So this is where the World Food Programme stepped in. And immediately after some months, we had a major earthquake in the northern part of Iran, that is in the Azerbaijan province of Iran. Then again, the World Food Programme stepped in. So like this, 3 years got over, and then what happens is that we have some proactive measures, that is not responding only to calamities. And this proactive measure, the best one was the feeding of school children in Togo in West Africa. Now today, many of the children have grown up to be able-bodied young men and women who have served in the armed forces and who have brought to the armed forces an ethos of peace, because they have been fed on a diet not only of food by the World Food Program, but also on a moral diet of peace. And now after this, what happens is that the 1970s, though it ensured that the World Food Program would continue to function, the 1970s was seen as a testing time for the World Food Program, because the 70s was also a period of economic turmoil. And as you all know, that economic turmoil leads to certain blockages in the supply chain, that is in the way grains are transported from one part of the world to the another. This was also compounded in 1973 by the oil shock, after which the oil markets went topsy-turvy, and then it was time again for the World Food Program to step in. This led to what we call a drought, which was partly natural and partly man-made in Sahel. So in Africa, we have the Saharas in the north, and then sub-Saharan Africa. There's a strip of land that is Sahel. So this is supposed to be a prosperous part compared to the Saharas, where you have actually agriculture going in. So 25 million people were affected in this in 1973. And this was the year when oil prices skyrocketed, and then you couldn't even move ships. So this drought persisted for 6 years. It had all the portents of making a civil war like situation in many countries, and around 12 countries. So immediately after 3 year effort by the World Food Program, this was brought to a stable situation. And then continuous lobbying by the World Food Program also ensured that the epicenter of the oil shock, that is Saudi Arabia, which had started the control of oil prices, was persuaded, and the King Faisal donated a large sum of money to the World Food Program. So here we see the World Food Program not only indulging in humanitarian affairs, but also in feeding children, like in Togo, which was a proactive measure, but now also using their diplomatic channels to get funding. So this was one of the first major steps which was taken to ensure funding. The same would be repeated 2 decades later, again by Saudi Arabia. Now, after in 1970s, we also see that this was a period when we had many civil wars going on. So this civil war also led to a lot of droughts. One of the most prosperous countries in the world in terms of agricultural output was Cambodia. But when the Khmer Rouge came, things got unsettled, and Cambodia, which was one of the greatest rice producing areas, that is known as the rice bowl of Southeast Asia, mainland Southeast Asia, collapsed. We have large numbers of Cambodians fleeing to Thailand and staying in camps, in refugee camps, in subhuman conditions. Again, the World Food Program stepped in. But things became, here it was actually more of logistics. So they were concerned because rice was easily available in Thailand and in the other neighboring countries. And so it was a problem of logistics and lobbying with the local authorities. But things got a step more difficult, or many more steps difficult, when you had a series of droughts. These droughts were there again in sub-Saharan and Saharan Africa, particularly in Ethiopia in the 1980s, and then in Somalia. The drought of Ethiopia in 83 to 1985 brought about so many chilling images on the covers of many of the international magazines like Time and Newsweek, that you had small children. Actually, these were not small children, these were teenage children who looked like small children because they were so emaciated, and some of them had maggots and worms in their heads, and they didn't even have the strength to remove these worms, and they were almost dying. So these images moved the world, and then it provided a positive support to World Food Program, that is, in times of crisis, do not bring politics when supporting any humanitarian effort. So this message also led to two major aid programs, that is a Band-Aid and the Live Aid. So we had also many singers like Bob Geldof, etc., who sang in favor of bringing aid for Ethiopia. The next was, again, you had a mix of what we call famine, which led to hunger, and then which also led to some severe crisis in Somalia, that is in 1989. With this crisis in Somalia, another lexicon, another word was added to the lexicon, political lexicon, that is the term failed state. That is, many countries became failed states because they could not provide any of the basic services to the people. And therefore, what happens when the center collapsed? You have the local potentates coming up. Some of them were warlords, and then these warlords represented only certain ethnic groups or certain cultural groups. And this led to a series of mismanagement, and then Somalia became a failed state, and later Afghanistan, and later Yugoslavia in the 1990s. And all these led to a lot of problems. It was at this particular time that the World Food Program actually stepped in, and then they managed to bring food not only by the conventional channels. These conventional channels earlier used to go through ships or through the convoys of trucks. But then you had certain situations where you couldn't uh, take the trucks because the roads were bombarded or the roads were blockaded. So then they started airdropping this one. A slight change was also given in the direction after Catherine Bertini took over as a director of the World Food Program in 1992. This was during the Yugoslav crisis, that is after the breakup of Yugoslavia into many of these different countries. And then you had the Eastern question coming up in the Balkans, which was again an ethnic tinderbox. And amidst the fighting which was going on, what happens is that you have many hungry people, and these hungry people joined in the camps of who was willing to provide food. So the link between hunger and war became more and more clear. It is not only that hungry people are fighting, but it reproduces itself in a vicious circle. There is a more hunger, more war. And so this vicious to be broken. And so therefore what happens is that the 1989 Kosovo conflict was a testing time in which before that we also had the Rwandan genocide, that is the genocide between the two main ethnic groups in Rwanda, that is the Hutus and the Tutsis. And it is during this time that the World Food Program made a remark that this is one of the most prosperous areas in Africa, in highland Africa, that is near the Great Lakes region. You have green everywhere. You have banana tree plants, then you have large number of plantations, but yet they are all going hungry. It is just because of certain political mismanagement. And so therefore they try to change the channels of delivering food. This unconventional idea of changing the channels of delivering food, particularly during the Rwandan crisis of 93-94, and then later during the Kosovo crisis, was a new step. And this was also further experimented in the Bangladesh floods in 89. Now, after this, what happens is they set up a humanitarian response facility in 2000, and which became the largest humanitarian agency, which was commended by the Guinness Book in 2002 with more than 14,500 staff, the permanent staff. Now, therefore, now you have a permanent staff, then you also have money, but now the whole point is to get to the logistics before hunger kills. And this is where they devise certain innovative schemes like participating with some logistic firms like TNT. And so this was a logistics firm far before the term courier became commonplace in the world. Many of these courier firms have actually participated with the World Food Program. And so they were able to actually, we have UNHAS, that is the United Nations, opened a new wing to airdrop food. And then this was tested in the 2004 tsunami. 14 countries were affected, and all these unconventional channels worked well. That is the logistics of all the United Nations agencies and many different NGOs were all clubbed together, and then they were very well coordinated. And then this was seen that in some cases, even though all of them were coordinated, you had food in the hands of private parties. So how to combat this? This is when they said that in 2005 in Sri Lanka, you just pay them cash transfers directly, so that the people could immediately buy food from whoever had been selling the food, that is local shopkeepers, etc. Again, in a repeat of 1973, the World Food Program lobbied, and then Saudi Arabia gave them a lot of money. This money was put to good use in 2009 when we have the crisis in Iraq. So this Iraq crisis actually has again led to what we call another unconventional way, in which instead of paying money, they paid them food vouchers. So if you present these vouchers in the shops, you could actually get money. Sorry, you could actually get food, and you could actually get some other commodities like vegetables or some other commodities, medicines, etc., which were for the everyday survival. Now, this marriage of technology was always on the mind of the WFP, and then we had cash through mobile in 2010. Now, this cash through mobile was also tested in the earthquake in Haiti, where 4.5 million people were served, and then again in South Sudan, and then later in 2014, we have the Ebola crisis in West Africa. So here we have now a situation in which the World Food Program is actually helping people in two ways. One is by giving food and preventing hunger. In another way, it is also taking a proactive measure to see that the local communities are actually self-sufficient. And this self-sufficiency is in tune with what we call the United Nations goal for 2030, that is the Agenda for Sustainable Development. There are 17 goals in this Agenda for Sustainable Development, and most of them are actually centered around how to build local communities. It is where we see that in the year 1979 and the early 80s, we had, after the death of Muhammad Siad Barre in Somalia, we have what we call the term failed state. And then Afghanistan became a failed state. We have more and more failed states coming up. Now we do not have failed states, and these failed states are now a thing of the past thanks to the World Food Program. And the United Nations recognized 5 major problems confronting the world. One was the problem of poverty. Second is a problem of political violence and terrorism. Third is a problem of environment. Fourth is a problem of hunger. And fifth is a problem of digital divide. So we see that digital divide is a problem which is now felt more acutely during the coronavirus crisis. And now most of these other problems are interlinked, climate change, etc., with poverty and agriculture. And in terms of alleviating hunger, and also by extension alleviating war, and also alleviating hatred, that is what the Buddha had long ago said, that poverty breeds hatred. So here we have a situation in which you have people who are able to think without being hungry. And so therefore what is happening is that you have communities which do not develop hatred because they know that they have a trusted partner in the World Food Program, and this partner does not expect, unlike many other NGOs which expect political loyalties or cultural loyalties, the World Food Program is a non-partisan organization. In recognition of the services of the World Food Program for so many years, the Nobel Peace Prize, which has been awarded since 1901, though with a break of some years, is awarded this year to the World Food Program, keeping in mind, and I have sketched a short career of the World Food Program. And then I would once again reiterate that the major point for which the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded was for the World Food Program to foster conditions for peace in conflict affected areas and for acting as a driving force in the efforts to prevent the use of hunger as a weapon of war and conflict. And thus, they not only eradicated hunger, but also the vicious cycle between war, insecurity, and hunger. So thank you all. I have kept my brief for 20 minutes. Do I have more time, sir? Hello?
Yes, sir. You can continue till 4:30.
Till 4:30. Okay. Yeah. Now, the question is, we go to a counterfactual. So people would say, so what about the World Food Program? Now, why should the rich nations subsidize the poor nations? Because they are ill-managed. Actually, most of the poor nations are not ill-managed. It is only the greed of some leaders which have led them to such a situation. So a gentle persuasion through very strong diplomatic channels, like the contributions of the Saudi government twice, which had enriched the coffers of the World Food Program, had seen to it that there is a redistribution of what we call money which had all to be channelized. Now, another problem with many of the NGOs which the World Food Program oversaw was there are two problems. One is like we have recently an initiative by some NGOs to provide credit cards to refugees because refugees do not have any credit cards. So how do they encash money or do any digital transactions? So keeping this problem in mind, the transfer of money through mobile phones, and that is digital currency. And secondly, the most important or landmark achievement was the issuing of food vouchers both in Iraq and to the refugees in Syria, both of whom are victims of local conflicts. And these local conflicts actually, what happens is that if not contained, they have the potential to spill over to all parts of the world. We all know that we have large number of refugees from Syria who have been actually flocking to Europe. Most of them are not interested to go to Europe and lead a life as a second class citizen laboring in the fields or in the factories, since they were all having respectable jobs back home. But the situation was very bad because making two ends meet was difficult. But with the World Food Program, now what has happened is many of them have stayed back, and now we have, after the peace process in Syria, where the towns of Idlib and some of the other towns in the northern parts of Syria, which are being rebuilt. So the earlier towns affected by earthquakes in Iran, or the building of dam, the Aswan Dam in the southern part of Egypt, or we have the tsunami affected regions, that is 14 countries, including some regions in South India, particularly Nagapattinam and other regions of Tamil Nadu. All these were beneficiaries of the largest of the World Food Program have all bounced back to life. So they have bounced back to life primarily because the World Food Program concentrated not just on individuals but also on communities. Now, the United Nations had certain goals, but these goals had all expired in 2016. That is the Millennium Development Goals. So now we have what we call Sustainable Development Goals. So these Sustainable Development Goals are one of the key driving forces for the World Food Program. And now there's also another issue to be talked about in this. Since I had already told you that there are around 14,500 people working full-time permanent staff of the World Food Program, we also have a situation in which we have certain international agencies, including the United Nations, who are embroiled in some controversies. Like, for example, the UN peacekeeping force of the Blue Helmets. They were accused of certain sexual crimes, particularly in Africa and also in Afghanistan. So the efforts of the organization to do some great work has been tainted by a few black sheep. We see that no such complaint has come against the World Food Program. And this also keeping in mind the sensitive nature of operations. Sensitive nature of operations is because, for example, we have many of these regions like Somalia or Sudan, parts of Ethiopia, that is southern Ethiopia or Yugoslavia. You don't have a straight road through which a convoy can go. Each of these areas are controlled by different warlords. Or, for example, as the WFP uses a milder language and calls them militants or political leaders. So the key point is to see that the shipments reach the last recipient before all the other recipients siphon away the shipments. Because most of the aid going to the third world countries actually led to a culture where certain leaders siphoned away many of these funds and they became rich at the cost of poor. So this led to what we call a minor industry. In many parts of India also you have a minor industry of NGOs. So the NGOs have started profiting on selling the poverty. But keeping this in mind, it was these two major steps. One is the partnership with TNT, which was a logistics firm in 2002, and then after which we have the cash through transfer in 2010. These two steps actually led to the adoption of digital technologies. By this, they also minimized a lot of human labor and then reams of paperwork, which was supposed to be the hallmark of government organizations, and then started to strategize this. That is, by this, they could see to it that the needy recipients who have a mobile phone or have some form of address, like, for example, some place of residence in a refugee camp, you have some number. Now, we have talked about these mainstream problems, but the United Nations does not operate in a vacuum. There are some countries, like, for example, Thailand. Thailand officially is a kingdom. So, as a kingdom, Thailand does not subscribe to the UNHCR dictates fully, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. So, here what happens is that most of the NGOs which give aid to the refugees, so these refugees have to say that the NGOs have done exceedingly good work. Otherwise, there is some problem because the refugees may be deported, particularly to the countries of Burma or the Myanmar or to Cambodia, where they have come from. Whereas in other countries, you can't deport the refugees who are enlisted with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. So this leads to a very peculiar problem. To surmount these type of problems where the refugees are able to also voice their political ideas while not being a trouble to the host countries and at the same time get genuine aid. So it is this particular keeping these three interests in mind, the minds of the refugees and their political ideas, the host country and the compulsions of the host country, and third, more importantly, the ideas of the World Food Program. So all these three had to be brought in tandem without causing annoyance to one another. So this is where they harnessed the role of technology, and this is particularly evident in both Iraq and in Syria, where they replicated the model of Thailand. And so this we have seen has brought about what we call not only eradicated hunger, in some places it has also brought about genuine understanding between different communities. As most of these leaders now have seen to it that since food is assured, now it is time for us to build new houses and infrastructure in these battle scarred zones. And now the coronavirus pandemic. Here also we see this is the latest and this was unexpected, but the World Food Program in a sense was better prepared for this because of their experience in 2014 with Ebola in West Africa. While most of us have been only hearing bad news of the coronavirus in 2020, one positive news in 2020 was that Ebola had finally been abolished. So a large part of the eradication, the total eradication of Ebola would also go to the World Food Program. And we hope that in future, very soon, coronavirus will also be eradicated totally. And then the role of WFP, particularly in many crowded settlements, like for example, we have the refugee camps in many parts of the world, where the WFP is silently continuing its services. So with this, I would stop and have not exceeded my time. And if there are any questions, comments, or clarifications, I would welcome. And once again, I would like to thank the Junior Science Club and Entropy Club and the august audience, professors, colleagues, students, research scholars, and my friends. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir. That
Thank
was
you.
a wonderful talk. Now we'll address the questions. First question. The WFP is a comparatively modern creation. Has there been has there been any initiative, if not on a global scale, then a smaller one, where the realization that food could help stop war and conflict was realized before in history?
Yeah, actually, many of the earlier rulers had certain traditional cultural resources that when there was conflict, there could be no war. When there was conditions of famine, you could not build houses because that would actually divert the water. When there was famine, you could not undertake certain activities like lavish activities like weddings or functions. These were activities, and also there were certain other cultural resources like you can't charge interest. One of the best examples is in the case of pre-modern Tibet, Though it was a poor country, it was the only country in the world which did not have an army or which did not have a famine, because the barley, which was the main product, could be stored for 70 years. So during times of famine, the barley was let out. But we have only few examples, and these are localized examples, not on large scale. Yeah,
Okay, sir, we'll go to the next question.
sure.
WFP was started long ago. Why do you think there is such a delay for its recognition on the global level?
Yeah, there is a delay for recognition of WFP, strangely, because the, as I told you, that the 80s were a period of ethnic conflicts till 89, and then before the 70s were a period of what we call famines. So the focus of the world has been always on what we call people who are giving solutions, managers to these problems, or giving certain solutions. Whereas WFP is not only giving solutions but also acting in a proactive role, and it's not advertising its act, unlike many other organizations which are part of certain countries. This is one of the major problems. It does not advertise itself, it is doing selfless service.
Okay, sir.
Yeah.
Next question. What was one of the biggest obstacles WFP had to tackle coming into the 21st century in view of the rising population in most underdeveloped countries?
The biggest, according to WFP's own admission, there is a lot of food to feed all the people in the world, but most of the food is going waste. Like we have the stories of wheat going waste in India. So even if the food is procured, even before it is procuring the food, the hard-grown food by the farmers through their hard labor is all left to rot. So this has actually caused a lot of heartburn. Actually, it's not the WFP's mandate, but then it feels very strongly about this aspect. So most of the food which is sanctioned to WFP, the supply chain is one of the major problems because they operate in areas of conflict.
Okay. Next question. What role is WFP playing during COVID-19?
Yeah, during COVID-19, actually, as I told you, the most uh, encouraging piece of news was that Ebola has finally been eradicated, and it's eradicated largely because most of the populations in West Africa have become self-sufficient, and we don't have any evidence of major conflicts after the Burkina Faso challenge. So similarly, what WFP is doing is that it is providing food on a scale to many of these communities, particularly refugee communities. As some commentators have been talking about this century is a century of refugees. So we shouldn't underestimate the number of refugees. You go to any continent or any country, there are large numbers of refugees. So these refugees are being provided food, and their conditions are what we call at a sustainable level, even though they do not have any income, even during the non-corona period. So with the absence of diminished supplies to them, WFP is keeping all of them afloat.
Okay, sir. Next question. Do you think that huge fundings from private organizations makes WFP a little biased for some countries?
This was one of the charges which were there because Saudi Arabia was one of the major donors to WFP. America sometimes threatens to pull out of WFP, saying that these are the problems of the third world. And then you also have some other countries like China. For example, if you see some other organizations like Greenpeace, what Greenpeace does is that it talks about the Amazon rainforest or the Southeast Asian rainforest, but Greenpeace doesn't talk in large spaces about the West African rainforest, or does not even talk at all about the uh, climate change in inner Asia because it is under Chinese control. So unlike this particular cherry picking or pick and choose, WFP at the same time, though it is very diplomatic, has not minced any words that so and so areas, even though there may be countries with a very high GDP or human development index, but there are some dark spots in these countries. So WFP is on a different level than NGOs because NGOs are dependent on certain funding agencies. WFP, since you asked the right question, though it has been receiving funds, it is not fully accountable without any conditions attached. So the United Nations bodies are also critical about human rights in many of these countries to whom WFP has been a recipient of. Yeah,
Okay, sir.
yeah.
Is WFP working effectively in India?
Yes, WFP is working effectively in India. We have around 2 to 300 staff being deployed sometimes. And but the best example of WFP success in India was during the tsunami crisis, 2014 tsunami. Actually, we were completely caught off guard during that tsunami. But the whole Indian Ocean rim, from Indonesia to the regions of Madagascar and also to parts of Africa, were all hit by the tsunami. Then suddenly we see many of these economies rebounding, and that was largely due to the efforts of WFP. But we also have some other examples, though on a smaller scale, but it has been continuous. Yeah,
Okay, sir.
yeah.
Is anyone in the meet having any questions? Okay, then. Thank you for addressing the question, sir. Now we have reached
May
the
I just
end of
have
the.
one question? I'm so
Yes, ma'am, please.
just
Yes, ma'am, please.
thank you so much for making it so simple for us to understand about it. I really enjoyed it. So I was kind of thinking that eventually any crisis we see, whether it is an environmental change that we talk about, or in terms of deforestation, or eventually coming to food crisis, I feel that they all boil down to a larger problem of this very uncontrolled, or rather not planned population growth, human population growth. So are these organizations, because not only the World Food Organization, but also generally all these organizations, do they communicate with each other, or are there any collective efforts or
Yeah,
individual efforts by these organizations to address this, or is it generally taken that we have sufficient resources and we will be able to sustain if only it is made available?
yeah, it's a very nice question. And then actually, as we were talking about the five major problems with the United Nations had mentioned, so among the Millennium Development Goals, and now since these goals could not be achieved, so we have 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals. So among these, population is one of the major contributors, because population, actually you have more population, then what happens is you have deforestation. So some groups of people say that it is actually climate change and it's reversible. So people like WFP and the UN also say that it is global warming, which is irreversible. So you see, they've taken a more strident stand. So population is one of the main root causes. So it also depends on the terminology. So since population is leading to global warming, and global warming is leading to scarce resources, so some countries attack the neighboring countries, which also leads to some group of people mainly traveling to other countries as refugees, immigrants, etc. So all these are interlinked, and these interlinkages are part of the UN mandate. So this coordination has reached a higher level mainly after 2000, when many of the NGOs and the United Nations organizations were brought on par, and WFP has played a major role in bringing all this. So as I told you in the beginning, that it is not only afterthought, that is, if there is a crisis, WFP enters and gives food, but also a proactive solution in many parts, particularly lobbying, then also disseminating information, and then acting as some pressure group, etc.
Are there ways where these organizations work in different part of the world, and even permit students participation in small events?
Yeah, they do, but they do permit student participation as volunteers. Then you can all log into a website, United Nations Volunteers. Right now, they're taking volunteers mainly after this coronavirus thing. You can be a digital volunteer. So some of our students who studied in this university, who are from these conflict-ridden areas. They acted as translators for some languages like Chinese, Arabic, etc. So you can volunteer there and offer your services. Like for example, many of the students from science background are good in science communication, which is a very rare subject now, and that is science communication for a variety of platforms. Then you also have conference services, etc. So you can join as volunteers for this. The web page is unvolunteers.org.
That's wonderful. Thanks. I think students should note this. Whoever is
Exactly. Yes,
interested.
madam.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Welcome.
Thank you, sir, for addressing the questions. Now we have reached the end of this talk. I would like to thank Dr. Aman Rajesh and all the attendees for joining this talk. Hope you all thoroughly enjoyed the talk. Stay tuned for the next talk of the day, which will be starting very soon.
Thank you very much, madam, and my thanks to all of you.
So, good afternoon, everyone. I welcome you all in the second session of Nobelium 2020 webinar series. In this session, we will be talking about Nobel Prize in Literature awarded to the American poet Lewis Gluck for her unmistakable poetic voice that, with austral beauty, makes individual existence universal. Lewis Gluck has published 12 collections of poetry and some volumes of essays on politics. All are characterized by striving for clarity, childhood and family life, the close relationship with parents and siblings, clearing the sense. Is it breaking? Right.
Now it seems clear.
Yes, Deepak, you can go
Oh,
ahead.
oh, sorry for the interruption. I will start from the Lewis. So the 2020 Nobel Prize in Literature is awarded to the Lewis Gluck. So Lewis Gluck has published 12 collections of poetry and some volumes of essays on poetry. All are characterized by a striving for clarity. Childhood and family life, the close relationship with parents and siblings, is the thematic that has remained central to her writings. With this brief introduction, it's my great pleasure to introduce our today's speaker, Professor Soumya Dachemma, to you all. Professor Soumya received her PhD from University of Hyderabad. Before joining University of Hyderabad as a teacher, she has taught English in Jamia Millia Islamia at New Delhi. She was a Commonwealth Fellow at the University of Southampton during September 2010 to February 2011. Presently, she is the professor and head of the Center for Comparative Literature in University of Hyderabad. Apart from teaching comparative literature, Indian literature, and cultural discourse in contemporary India, her research interests include minority discourse and Kodawa language and culture. Professor Soumya has selected for Indo-Hungarian Education Exchange Program for teachers in 2010. She was also awarded with the Fulbright Nehru Academic and Professional Excellency Fellowship for the year 2019 to 2020. She has also published many research articles in well-reputed national and international journals. Before start our session, let me remind you that if you have any questions during talk or even after talk, please put them in the chat box or in comment session so that we can consider them at the end of the session, which is more convenient. Now, without any delay, I invite Professor Soumya to illuminate us with a flash of literature. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, everyone. I know Vidya and Atreya, but I'm sure there are many of you who are behind this. In fact, I'm very pleasantly surprised that the Science Club is organizing talks ranging from economics, literature, and other disciplines as well. Way to go, people. I'm very proud of our students. It's been long since I interacted with IMA or IMSC students. I have taught there long ago, not in recent times, but I hear very good things from you, and you should keep it going. I had sent the presentation, very minor changes I have made. I'll share my screen so that you can see it as I present. Just take a second. Okay, is that visible?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. As I mentioned in the abstract, this talk is not necessarily about the poet, and as Atreya or Deepak said, it's not about illuminating what she has written and so on, but basically raising questions, right? Critical thinking about what Nobel Prize is all about, and especially questions around literature. But as I say in the presentation, it's also about uh, not just literature, but also about other Nobel Prizes as well, right? And I strongly believe critical thinking is essential to all disciplines. Science wouldn't have progressed if one stopped questioning what already existed, right? We would still be stuck with Newton's laws, or we would be still stuck with the earth centric kind of a view if people didn't question and move science forward. So I do think science, literature, or any other discipline should be, critically engaged with from various perspectives, and this is true for literature as well as any other disciplines. So in fact, when you people asked me to talk about Gluck, the first thing I did was to look up how to pronounce her name. I had not heard of this poet before. I heard of her only after the Nobel. So I had to see how to pronounce her. Even now, I'm not sure if I'm getting it right, right? Lucy Gluck is what I looked up. And Lucy Gluck, and I also looked up your name. What is Nobelium? So as you can see on the screen, it's the chemical element of atomic number 102, and it is not a natural element. It is produced by bombarding two other elements. And I'm actually wondering if poetry is like this, right? Although people think about poetry as very natural, it comes to you, it's an emotional state, and so on and so forth. But you should know, and I'm sure you're aware, that poetry, like any other thing, is a trial and error method. You work, you write, you read it again, you edit it, you kind of make it attain a state of perfection. So it's not a very natural thing. If you just write what comes to your mind then and there, it is not a finished product. Any poet, any good poet works, re-edits, revises, goes through a whole lot of drafts, just like your experiments, or just like your research papers, just like anything you do, you think, redo, and do it. So poetry is also not natural like this Nobelium element is. So that's one thought I wanted to share, that poetry, although natural, the idea may be natural, but when you put it out there in the world, it is work. There's much work that has gone behind it before it comes out to you to read or to listen, and so on and so forth. So maybe
Hello,
this
excuse me,
poem,
ma'am.
yeah,
I'm sorry to interrupt you, ma'am.
let me just do that. Okay. Is that okay?
Yes, ma'am, this is good. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So this is a poem. I looked up many of her poems, and this one caught my attention. It's called The Image. Uh, I'll just read it aloud so that, when you listen to poetry more than reading, I feel there is a certain kind of connection that one can make. So this poem by Lucy Gluck is called Image. Try to think, said the teacher, of an image from your childhood. Spoon, said one boy. Aha, said the teacher. This is not an image. It is, said the boy. See, I hold it in my hand, and on the convex side, a room appears, but distorted, the middle taking longer to see than the two ends. Yes, said the teacher, that is so. But in the larger sense, it's not so. If you move your hand even an inch, it is not so. You weren't there, said the boy. You don't know how we set the table. That's true, said the teacher. I know nothing of your childhood. But if you add your mother to the distorted furniture, you will have an image. Will it be good? Said the boy. A strong image? Very strong, said the teacher. Very strong and full of foreboding. I didn't think my job today was to explain the poem or anything. If you look up on the net, you will see that uh, Louise Gluck has written a lot, uh, and she's also a professor at the Yale University. And most of her poetry is about the individual emotions, is around family, is around relationships, the strong relationships that we all of us are bound with, and so on and so forth. And this poem is also an example of such a poetry that gives you a sense of how strong a family relationship can be wherever it is, right? Whether it's in the dining table, whether it's in a convex spoon, whether it's an image that is distorted, you can't just dissociate from your relationships are everywhere, and it manifests in many ways. So that explanation is not something that I wanted to do, but instead, as I said, look at how we have been actually reading, listening, and understanding poetry. So the first question I have is, who actually reads poetry? I don't know. If it was an interactive session, I would have actually loved it and asked you people, do you people read poetry? Do you people write poetry? Anyone? I am unable to see the screen actually, so I'm just looking at the PowerPoint. But yeah, very few people these days, even my own students, right? They prefer novels. They prefer a narrative prose, that is prose writing, not poetry writing, to poetry. So I wonder what has happened to poetry, right? But this was not always the case. Poetry, as you are aware, is one of the oldest forms of expressive arts. And when I say oldest, it is the verbal form, right? It's not a written form. Even in the written form, poetry is one of the oldest form. But if you take other forms of art, for example, painting or stone carving, these forms of art are much more older, and poetry is much later. And written poetry, of course, in the history of human beings, is much later than other kinds of arts. And initially, there were very clear kind of societal regulations as to who can write poetry, how poetry should be written. It should be written in a certain formula. In fact, it is called meter. So not everyone could write poetry. You had to be associated with a court, or you had to be an aristocrat. Very few people outside this aristocracy, elite aristocracy, could write poetry, right? And who not just write poetry, people who could learn to read and write were very limited across the world. Not only India, but across the world, very few people could read and write. So poetry as an oral thing, in contradiction to written poetry, oral poetry is much more familiar to all of us. The songs, right? Anybody could sing any song. You could make up a song, and this kind of oral poetry has been passed on from generation to generation. So in this sense, poetry in fact is much more accessible. It reaches out to a whole lot of people in its oral form much more than its written form. So there is a very clear difference in singing, in listening, and in reading poetry. Of course, some of the written poetry also gets sung. For example, I mean, if you take the Bhakti poets of India, who are, who range from Kerala to Assam. So these Bhakti poets initially composed, they just sang. But these days, these poets, whether it is Kabir, whether it's Mira Bai, and so on and so forth, they have their songs which were sung, which are very popular, are being written down only in recent days. So singing and composing and singing has been much more popular among a mass of people than writing and reading poetry. So why is this important? This is important because none of us knew Lucy Gluck until the Nobel, right? So, but we all know different, we all know Kabir, although we may not have read him, we might have heard his Doha once in a while, and so on. So there is also this nostalgia because poetry is associated with such a refined form of literature that people are not reading poetry. People have moved on to reading novels, reading short stories, and of course, these days people have moved on to the visual media, right? So you only watch things but not read things. So there are a whole lot of debates around poetry, and which is why I thought, how do we understand Bob Dylan, who is a singer, who is a very popular singer, who was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. Even then, there was a whole lot of debates. Should we actually consider Bob Dylan as a literator, or is he just a singer? So that just is a question, right? But to me, if you reach out to a whole lot of people like Bob Dylan did, that is much more worthier than any poetry which remains on paper and not being read. So yeah, these are the questions and some points that have perhaps all of us should think about. I got these details obviously from the net. I can't memorize all the individuals who got the Nobel Prize. In literature, for example, there are 117 people so far who have won the Nobel, right? And among this 117 people, only 16 are women. And among the 16, among the 117, there are only 3 black people and 1 black woman. 8 are Asian, including Rabindranath Tagore, who is the only person from the Indian subcontinent to win the Nobel Literature Prize. And if you minus all these things, you will get a majority of white men who have won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and these are largely from North America or Europe. So, should we, as commoners, unquestioningly accept the greatness of any award, or should we ask different questions that are perhaps significant to the world we live in? And does this mean it is only white men? Because you can see that around 100 white men are the most imaginative because they have won the Nobel Literature Prize. Are their writings most influential? And remember, these figures, as I said, are not only true for literature, but if you look up the facts for sciences, economics, Peace Prize, and so on, you will find that these facts are very, very true for other disciplines as well. So, what is this criteria that lies behind any award? Does that mean that the work has to be path breaking? And who defines the path breaking nature of any work? And for literature, there is one major limitation, as I have written it. So if you write something, it has to be in English or in any major European language, French perhaps, or it has to be translated into English. Otherwise, there is no way that you will be considered for a Nobel Prize. So this is a very, very major limitation, as you will understand, right? So I have to write in English or I have to be translated into English. So this pretty much means that a huge section of writers writing in thousands of languages are out of the award race, right? So the greatness is determined by English. This is one of the major criteria other than the other criteria. And even if you're translated, so there might be n number of poets writing in Telugu, n number of writers who actually gets translated, right? How do we know who is getting translated? Who is choosing the text? Why are some texts chosen over others? These are very crucial questions for us to ask. So does that mean that people writing in Telugu or people writing in Kodava, the language I speak, which is a very small language, are not creative, are not path breaking? Or does it, is their work not influential enough to the people who read their work? It may be influential for a whole lot of Telugu people writing in Telugu, but it doesn't matter for the Nobel Peace Prize at all. But at the same time, awards mean recognition, it means money, not just to the author. You should also remember that it is also a huge publishing industry that can market the author and everything around the author and his or her work. So it's a network of things that awards are around. You take any major award in literature, whether it's the Pulitzer Prize, whether it's the Booker Prize, whether it's the Commonwealth Author Prize, whether it is Nobel Prize for Literature, all these prizes in literature, so-called big prizes in literature, will be awarded to people who have been translated into English. So that is one major thing I want you to remember. This I have already said. I hadn't known of Lucy Gluck before her Nobel, and I'm not sure whether you did. How has she changed our world? And I want you to ask this question for every Nobel, not just literature. One might actually think it is easier in disciplines like science to say that a particular work or discovery is path breaking, right? So unlike in literature, whom we have may have read or may not have read, in science it may be a certain kind of measurable kind of a aspect, right? Uh, 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 you come up with a new vaccine for corona, and so that's really path breaking work, and so on and so forth, right? So it's much more easier than literature in a certain sense. But it is also good to ask, what were the conditions in which one works? We in UOH, right? We scientists, our colleagues, you people who are working in the University of Hyderabad, some scientists in Princeton, some scientist in Kakatiya University, someone else in Nagaland University. What are the chances that Nagaland scientist and the Kakatiya University scientist, what are the chances that they will win a Nobel? And why, right? And this why, I think, is a very important question everywhere. And even for science to progress, why is this so? And science is not just science in the laboratory, but there are a whole lot of conditions that enable science, and therefore this is true for all of us, right? What are the conditions that make someone work or achieve something like a Nobel? One should also think of how there are very few women scientists or scientists from minority backgrounds winning Nobel. Again, why? So this again, I said, I read Lucy Gluck while I prepared for this talk, and her poems are very compelling. I read through some 20-25 poems, quite compelling, sometimes disturbing, sometimes very beautiful, beautifully melancholic, and it also disturbs. And they also talk about how each one of us feel, right? How each one of us feel about the world around us, about the immediate world. She's not talking about things that are far away, right? She's talking about our immediate world, things that are very much around us. And see, here is a short poem. Look, a butterfly. Did you make a wish? You don't wish on butterflies. You do so. Did you make one? Yes. It doesn't count, right? So there is also a sense of dystopic view. Even in the earlier poem that we read, the image, it is a quite a dystopic kind of a narrative that, you know, it makes you feel sad at times, but it also says that this is the world we live in. You live in a world of contradictions, right? It is beautiful. You can make a wish, but it may not count at all. So whether one has a Nobel or not, does it count, is something that we can ask. So I just thought I'll just give you a few pointers which you may know, which some of you may have in your mind but haven't given it a deeper thought. So, of course, poetry can be very conventional, right? You follow the given rules of poetry, you write what people expect you to write, and so on and so forth. It can be reactionary. Reactionary in the sense that it is not progressive. It reacts against any change. It doesn't want any change in the society. So poetry could be conventional, poetry could be reactionary, but poetry can touch you. There are poems, of course, even this butterfly poem, which we just read, of 4 lines, it can touch you, right? It can sensitize you. It can touch the innermost feelings of your being, and poetry can awaken what was dormant for a long, long time. And of course, poetry can revolutionize. There are a whole lot of poets, mostly poems whose poems have been sung. For example, if if more than Janaganamana, I would say Sare Jahan Se Acha. It's a poem, right? And it's a poem whose author we may not know at all. But whenever we hear or sing Sare Jahan Se Acha, Hindusta Hamara, it can revolutionize us, it can sensitize us, we feel touched by it. So that's what poetry can do. Poetry can also be very powerful. The same example I gave you, or there are n number of examples where poetry is powerful, reaches out to a whole lot of people, and that is the power of poetry. I thought we could, I mean, when we talk about poetry's powerful nature, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Telangana movement, how many of you are aware of Gaddar, right? This who's called the people's poet. I have given you the link, or you can just look up Gaddar and his poetry. Gaddar for me is the example of the poet who is much more than the noble, right? He composes in Telugu and he sings. He is not known as a singer per se. He's not a singer in that sense of the word, but then his songs during the Telangana movement and before, right? any most people in Telangana know his songs, right? It has reached out to people who cannot read, people who can read, people who are in different sections of the society. So his poems and his songs have a reach that perhaps no other poet in Telugu had, right? And this is essentially because it's not limited to writing. Poetry combines and circulates in various ways, and this is what makes poetry much more powerful. And Gaddar's song here is Podustunna Poddumida. I'm sure many of you have heard this, and it even now, although I'm not from Telangana, I really love listening to this song every now and then. You should go and check it out. I just thought I'll give you 2 poems which I really like. One is Speak Out by Faiz Ahmad Faiz. Of course, before the independence, he belonged to the undivided India, and later on, he is now known as a Pakistani poet. But then he becomes Pakistani only after 1947. Before 1947, it is undivided India. So these boundaries are also, naturally created, like the Nobelium is. So this poem Speak Out is by Faiz Ahmad Faiz. And then there is another poem which I really like. I teach this in classrooms sometimes. So it is Still I Rise. Maya Angelou is a very well-known African American poet, and this is one of her poems that was even being sung during the civil rights movements and so on in the US, and therefore much better known than, again, the written poets. Well, that's all I had to say. I know I didn't talk about Louis Gluck much, and that was not my intention also. My intention was to make you think about poetry and its function at large. So I hope your time was worthwhile, and anything you want to ask, please go ahead. Thank you so much. Thank you, Science Club. Thank you, Entropy. Thank you, Atreya and Vidya, and whoever names, whose names I don't know.
Yes, thank you very much. And yes, ma'am, that was a very enthusiastic and very delightful talk. Because we, most of us, as a science student, we always remain too far from such a bright talk about literature, poetry, writings. So thank you very much, ma'am. And now we will go to questions. Ma'am, I will read the questions for you from YouTube.
Oh, they're from YouTube. Okay.
Yes, ma'am, they are from YouTube.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So the questions are pasted here, right? Nikhil Kumar's is the first question.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
This is the first question from Nikhil Kumar.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you want to read it? You can read it and I can answer it.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I think poetry is impulsive and impatient. Thoughts that ought to be expressed. That doesn't mean you cannot edit it after writing it down. And I prefer poem in contrast to prose because poetry leaves a part of thought to imagination rather than prose, which pretty much explains every single setting, imaginary and objects in exaggerated, explicable ways.
Yeah, that's true. Poetry can be impulsive, but I also think other forms of writing can be impulsive, can be impatient. Um, and yes, whatever gets published does go through edits, whether we like it or not. All our impatience, all our thoughts, all our impulsiveness does get edited by the publisher. There is very little that comes out without editing. Although when we write it, the first draft of what we write, it is quite impulsive. I agree with you at that point. But when the final product is out, it is an edited version. There is, I would think of any example. I can't think of any example where it goes unedited in the published form. Yes, poetry does leave a lot of things to imagination. It's not complete, right? It doesn't give you a closed end. But again, I would like you to think of films. I would like you to think of other, maybe a short story, which are open ended. It actually depends on the poet or the writer or the filmmaker, right? There are a whole lot of films which are open ended. In fact, some films, they have two endings. You can choose whichever ending you want to. So it's up to the poet, it's up to the author to create a scene or create a climax that is much more open ended. Poetry, maybe because it is short, it doesn't give you a whole lot of details. But then I would say there are a whole lot of writers that do this with novels or short stories or films or even essay writing. It gives you an open ending.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, next question is for the world that has been completely under European bondage through centuries. The mainstream is always the majority's language, I guess.
Yeah. That is
Some
that's true. Especially in awards like this are very Eurocentric, very Anglo-American centric, right? So that's absolutely right. But I would also urge you to think of our own situations in India. So what are the languages that we read in? So do we read in Telugu? Do we read in Tamil? Do we read in Gujarati? Or how many of us know even the names of languages that are spoken in northeastern India? Right? I don't know how many of you know whether it is Meitei, whether it is Khasi, whether it is Angami. I don't know even if we know the names of language people speak in our own country. So instead of looking far away, I would urge you to think how much attention have we paid to our own languages, right? What have we done to our own languages? So yes, it is Eurocentric. It dominates the world, but what is the world that is immediately around us? So in this way, perhaps this is one thing we can learn from Louis Gluck, that She talks about the world around us. And I think it is important for us too to talk about the world around us, to listen to what people speak, to understand and work alongside with them, right? Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Next question is from Manasvita. Do poetries dominate other literature works?
Where is that question? That is
It's in
very
the chat
sad.
box, ma'am.
Okay. No, no. Before that, there was Nikhil's question, so I was just wondering. Okay, let me answer Manasvita's.
Ma'am, actually, these were the comments on YouTube, and
Okay.
Nikhil has posted them in the chat box for all of us to read.
Okay. 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 So, does poetry dominate other literature works? Until 19th century, yes. If, as you know, I said in the beginning, right, poetry is one of the oldest forms of both verbal form of art and also written form of art. So as a written form of art, poetry was the form of art until 19th century. So you are considered a literature person. There's no term like literature. There was only the term called poet. It did dominate other forms. But after 19th century, when prose started gaining ground, and this has a long history. I mean, I'm sure it requires another kind of a discussion, along with the printing press, the growth of printing press from 16th century onwards, and so on. How the art of prose grew, right? Narrative prose. So, uh, and short stories and novels and essay writing and drama and so on. Drama did exist, drama and poetry, but drama was also considered poetry because when you write drama before the 19th century, it was always in the poetical form. Most of the times it was in the poetical form. Drama was written, plays were written in poetical form. So after 19th century, it's no longer poetry that dominates, right? Especially in 20th and 21st century. That's why I mentioned that there's a very big concern and also nostalgia that poetry, the art of poetry, is declining because there are hardly any takers. It's a very select few that read poetry. But again, contrast it with Gaddar. Sung poetry actually has much more takers, and in given context, not always perhaps, but singing has much more takers. And singing, what do you sing? You sing poem after all, right? A poem is written and then it is sung. Much of our Hindi film songs, in fact, I'm also familiar with Kannada film songs which are very popular, are also poems written by poets that were then made popular. So there is a whole lot of you know uh, uh, complexities involved when you say that poetry doesn't dominate now, because songs do dominate our lives, but reading and writing poetry, reading written poetry, is no longer in fashion.
Yes, ma'am. Our next question is from Ashutosh.
Mhm.
He asked that, ma'am, do you write poems? If so, what drives you to write? Is it to unwind and escape? And how much it does any kind
Very
of recognition mean to you?
okay. This question is not pasted here, right? I can't see that
Yes,
anyway.
ma'am. It's there, ma'am.
It's there. Huh? Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
I have written one poem. No, I am not a poet at all. Yes, when you feel, when something touches you a lot, I write. I do write. I mean, I prefer writing newspaper articles. In recent times, that's what I do. I feel newspaper articles are read much more than poetry. So I do write newspaper articles other than my research work, of course. But research also, I should say, is like poetry. Any research, even if it's a science research, you should be passionate about it. There's no point in doing a research that you're not passionate about, right? You do research so that some people will look up your research and it changes them, it changes the world around you. So research for me is also like poetry. So whatever research I do it uh, because I'm passionate in the area, right? So no, but I am no a poet. But passion is one thing that would define any kind of artwork or even research. So once you're passionate, of course you write. Of course, there are a lot of people of different kinds. You might write out of self-interest. You may even write to get a prize, right? Of course, we all have written essays to get a prize. We have written essays. We have drawn things to get prizes, whether in schools or colleges. So there are different reasons for one to write poetry, but I think passion is the strongest motive.
Yes, ma'am. Our next question is from Ashutosh.
Hmm.
Wondering how many poets were snubbed purely because their work didn't carry the same weight in translated version.
Yes, I have no idea, Ashutosh. I wish, this world was a different place. We all wish. So, yeah, thousands and thousands. Not snubbed, but yeah, I don't know if we can call it snubbed because it never visible. If it's not in English, at least for these prizes, it is never ever visible. So yes, it's a sad state, but yeah.
Yes, sir. Ma'am, yeah, there is one more question related to the previous question. There are sometimes be inaccuracies while translating the literature to the English. So, is this the reason why the Literature Nobel Prize are awarded to the works originally written in English?
Sorry, where is the question?
Ma'am, it's not in the chat box, it's
Okay,
from YouTube.
okay. Can you repeat it?
Yes, ma'am. So, there are sometimes be inaccuracies while
Mhm.
translating the literature to English.
Yeah.
Is this the reason why the Literature Nobel Prize are awarded to the works originally written in English only?
No, no. Okay, don't get me wrong. No, there are Nobel Prize in literature which are given to translated literature as well, but it has to be translated in English, right? So inaccuracies in translation, well, this is a huge debate in translation studies. How accurate can a translation be? How good, how faithful can a translation be? But I mean, I don't want to enter into that debate right now, but not just inaccuracies, but which text gets translated, right? Which poems get translated? You can think of Gitanjali, which won the Nobel Prize for Rabindranath Tagore. He himself translated it. Subsequently, many others have translated it, but he himself had translated it. But a whole lot of other writers. This year it is Louis Gluck, but the last year it was Peter Handke, who's an Austrian, who wrote, if I'm not mistaken, in German. Okay, and then before that it was somebody else. These works, they write in different European languages, but they're translated to English. So there are translated works that have won the Nobel, but inaccuracy in translation, no, that is not the reason I would say for somebody to win the Nobel or not. You do get very good translations, but which text is chosen, which author is chosen for translation is a much bigger question.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Next question is from Nisha.
Mhm.
Ma'am, science and poetry are two different poles. So many a times I just got stuck between two. My poetry do not go with my studies often. Any suggestion?
uh, I would blame our education system for this, for not, blame all of us, perhaps teachers, the system, and so on, for not not providing our children an interdisciplinary kind of an education, right? That can make connections between science, that can make connections between poetry, science, economics, and so on. It's not impossible. It's just that our priorities are so very skewed. Uh, in fact, I should tell you, perhaps I was a BSc student, right? Physics, chemistry, and maths, and then, but my basics I realized in BSc were not at all good, and then I shifted. After my BSc, I shifted to literature. From your childhood, you have to have a basic. You have to have a system that inculcates, uh, a love for learning everything. That love for learning, I'm, I'm very disappointed with ourselves. If you look at Hyderabad today, you will only find engineering colleges. you won't find a good degree college which offers a good BA or a BSc program. Very few colleges are left. So, I mean, it speaks a lot about our system. If we are stuck, I don't think you should be stuck. Who asked that question? I'm sorry. Who is
It's
this? Who
in
asked?
YouTube. It's in
Okay,
YouTube.
yeah, who stuck between
Nisha, ma'am.
science and poetry. I think you can bring in your poetry to the science and bring in your science to poetry with a little effort. It costs us effort and time, but it is possible to do so, a happy harmony between science and poetry. It is quite possible. You would know that many scientists are very good musicians. Some scientists are very good sports people, and so on. And of course, the whole, I don't know, have you heard of Abraham Varghese?
No,
Uh,
no.
Abraham Varghese was a trained physician, is a doctor. He works in Stanford now, and his books, it is autobiographical. He's also written novels. His books are based on his medical practice. His books are based on science, so to speak, right? But they're so wonderful. You should read Abraham Varghese. You should read Paul. I forget his second name. He's also an Indian origin doctor who died of cancer at 36. But his autobiography, When Breath Feels Air, right? That's like it can move you like anything. And in fact, and the Emperor of Melodies. Have you read that? It's a book on cancer. Siddharth Mukherjee. He is also a doctor, again based in US. I don't know what to say about this, but many of the Indian origin um, uh, scientists in US have attempted to write these barriers they break between literature and science. This is what I want to say, that you need not get stuck. You can break the barriers, and these are the three authors I know who have actually moved me a lot, and I have also learned a lot about science through their writings. Yeah, so it needs a little effort, it needs discipline, it of course needs passion.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, our next question is from Dev Rahija. Also, ma'am, do
Mhm.
you think that a lot strife in society makes art more refined and better?
uh, a strife in society makes art better. I don't want to generalize this. I don't know, but it makes art visible at least, right? I don't know whether it is refined. Again, the example I gave, right? Gaddar songs, which are very popular. Would you call it refined? Would you call it very popular? Would you call it very touching? Would you call it very powerful? So strife during the Telangana movement, Gaddar became, or even before that, he was popular. But at that moment, at those years, he was, his songs really became very popular. So it's not a question of refined, but how art reaches out is how I would put it. Yeah, strife makes art more visible, more powerful. Yeah, it comes to the street perhaps in refined sometimes, and sometimes in whatever forms. And I don't think one can judge the refinement of art. It's very difficult to judge refinement in art.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Our next question is why are a lot of poets Marxist? Like you gave example of Faiz Ahmed Faiz, whose poetry truly love, and also someone like Sahil Ludhianvi.
Uh, why are a lot of poet Marxists? No, a lot of poets are not Marxists. I think no, actually, it's not true. This is just one example I gave. You take a whole lot of other examples. If it is Sarojini Devi Naidu, whom you know, or Gurram Joshua in Telugu, or today people writing in Telugu or Hindi or whoever, they are not majority of them are not Marxists. Only Faiz Ahmad was a Marxist. Maya Angelou, whom I quoted, Maya Angelou is not Marxist. Well, of course, Gaddar was a Marxist, but yeah, not all of them are. Sahir Ludhianvi, yes.
I
Most of
think
the older Bollywood, well, not Bollywood, Hindi film poets, yeah, they did belong to a different generation.
okay. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. I think it's the last.
Sure.
If permitted, thank you. Really enjoyed listening to you, Soumya. Really enjoyed. Very thought provoking, and I hope students really got provoked. I actually always has wished, that anyone who reads anything which is enjoyable should be spread. And if we, anything you read, and the only reason I miss reading good lot of things is because I don't understand the language. So, is there any way we can encourage such kind of environment to begin with in university, and then possibly reach out to others in and around us, create an environment where even it does not matter, because we have all kind of students in our campus, various languages, they read their literature, they have the talent, and you may be interacting with them so much. Can just identify, encourage them, nurture them to make, translate that them for us, possibly, which we just miss if
That's I know, Sharmist. I wish there was a way. I mean, what in my department we have a reading group. It's largely department based. What we encourage students to do is get literature from their own languages. Yes, it has to be translated into English because otherwise, all of us have students from all over India, right? Otherwise, there is no one language that is common to us all. So we encourage students to bring the literature from their own languages and discuss them in the reading group. Same is true with films. We also have a film club that encourages viewing. These days, in fact, visual medium I think is much more. Uh,
yeah.
it's reaching out through subtitles and so on, whereas reading requires training that is unimaginably painstaking. So one thing we could do is have a reading group across departments, even if it is within the CIS. I think it can be encouraged where students bring in literature from their own languages, right? Even if it is rough, translation is a huge task. It's not easy to translate. It's
It's
even,
not easy.
yeah, it's more difficult than research, I would say, at times, right? If you want to
Agreed.
bring the spirit of that work, you will have to spend nights and nights on translating. So even if we can get a rough idea in such reading groups, maybe a reading group where people get literature and films and short pieces, perhaps not long pieces, and discuss them. That's one way. That's one thing which we could perhaps do. Yeah.
Also, the other way around, I feel that there are many stories which are, let us say, even in English,
Mm.
cannot reach to
Yeah.
local people, youngsters, children, just
Yeah.
because they are not aware. Everybody doesn't know English. Even if we
That's
say that we speak English, but how much do we understand?
yeah.
If people in our students, whoever, or anywhere in our whoever is near us, they can use that, they understand English, they translate them into literature, into local literature. I think that's also very enriching the entire environment a lot.
That is true.
I see this
In
whole
fact,
bunch of students, I see this whole bunch of students who have really organized this. They themselves are so talented, and we can reach out to them. So
that's true, Sharma.
thank
It has to
you.
be both ways. One is translation to English. In fact, if you look at the translation scene in India right now, a whole lot of things are being translated into English, right? But the
Hmm.
other way is not true. How much of what is written in English or other languages comes to our own languages? This way is very imbalanced. A lot of it goes to English. One, because you get more recognition, you get more money if you are translated into English. But if you are writing back into Telugu or into other languages, the readership may not be, or recognition may not be as much as it is there in English.
Okay.
So there is that imbalance there of language, market, money, publishing, and so on and so forth. But then yes, there are translators, people who are working in this. But yeah, this effort has to be much more all encompassing. It's very little. The effort so far is not great, but it's also our language training. Our children these days, from your childhood, you're trained largely in English, which is necessary. We wouldn't be speaking here if we don't need English. I'm all for English, but I'm also for training ourselves into other languages as well, right? So if
Correct.
you're from your fifth standard, you're training for IITs and whatnot, language
Yeah.
is just something you pass. You don't even need a good marks in language. You just need to pass. So that's no way to encourage our languages. So
But at the end, it doesn't help really. I think we require everything, and it's one of the very important component. And from coming from being in science, I fully I mean recognize the importance of both communication, understanding languages, more than one languages if at all required. Thank you so much.
definitely.
Enjoyed your talk a lot, and thank you for making it easy for us to understand about the whole thing. Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
Sharmista. I am so glad you all are here. I didn't expect faculty members to be here. I thought it'll be just students, but I'm really glad we could have this conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
So thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much for your talk. Can I ask a last question? It's
Sure.
very, it's a short
Sure.
question. It's a
Yeah.
last question. And because, like in any poetry, in any literature, if you talk about like in Hindi literature, Urdu literature, English literature, so
Yeah.
writing poetry or any basically mainly poetry. So mainly there are two components. Like we have to follow the rules which are already there in the literature, and on the same time we have to include the feelings in our writing. Without feelings, there is no writing, as per me, whatever
Mhm.
I have. So but nowadays there are some writers which are writing open writings, open poetry. They are not following the rules.
Yeah.
Okay. So what do
Mm,
you think? Like, is it good to write this type of open poetry, and what is the scope? Like, how better we can reach up to people by writing those kind of open poems, basically?
Yeah. So, Deepak, I think there is these days this following of rules of writing poetry is doesn't exist any longer. You wrote poetry according to a rhythm, according to a meter, right? So all languages of India and in English or anywhere, they followed a meter. They followed a particular pattern while writing poetry, and you had
Yes, sir.
to use a certain set of vocabulary. I mean, I don't know and you had, in fact, until even when Tulsidas, I'm sure you know Tulsidas, who wrote Ramcharitmanas. He was writing in the 16th century. When he wrote Ramayana, he used Avadhi, right? Avadhi is
Yes, sir.
a language spoken in the Awadh region of what is now called Uttar Pradesh. And he was banished because he didn't follow the conventional way of writing poetry in Sanskrit. So he was banished from the so-called Rampur of Varanasi to Lankapur, which I think the Ganga divides these two. I'm not very familiar, but this is the story I have read. So he was banished from the aristocratic part of Varanasi into the part where the outcasts live, all because he wrote poetry in a style that was not accepted by the conventional writing. So, but this is no longer true today, and since many years, even since Tulsidas's time, people have broken the rules of poetry, right? And people have come up with new innovative stuff, and especially today, people, there is no rule for poetry. As you said, it is open writing. It's called free verse, right? Free verse versus poetry. So it is
Yes,
free.
ma'am.
It doesn't follow any rules or regulations. It's open to everything. So that's no longer true. But yeah, there was a time when your life could be threatened if you broke the rules of poetry.
Deepak, I believe you are missing the rhyming part of it, is it?
No,
The
Yes, ma'am.
poetry.
Yes, ma'am.
We all are so
Because
used to having poetry only thinking that okay, it has to rhyme at the end, you know. But
yeah, I
yes,
yes,
missed
as
ma'am.
you
the
know,
No, no, ma'am,
yeah.
rhymings we can set, right? Yes, ma'am, rhymings we can set, but the problem is like meter is more difficult. It's very difficult. So I'm
No,
more concerned about the meter, not
no,
rhyming.
no. let it just be in a flow. There is no meter. If it rhymes, fine. If it doesn't rhyme, fine. It's just yeah. It's really open. You can write your poetry however you want.
So thank you. And yes, ma'am, that was very, very enthusiastic session for all of us. It doesn't matter science people, non-science people, and yeah, we are science people, and we do read literature, that is scientific literature, but in a very different perspective. We never sing that literature. We never like this like song, but we just talk about that literature. We never sing that literature, but that this literature is very interesting. So thank you very much, ma'am, for your enthusiastic talk. I heartily thank you on the behalf of Junior Science Club and Trophy Club for this delightful session. And we will be looking to attend your session in the future also. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. Thank
Thank
you
you
very
so
much for
much.
your time.
Yeah. It's my pleasure, and I really enjoyed the discussion session. And I do hope you'll carry your good work. And it's my pleasure and honor to be with you guys. Thank you so much. Yeah, when breath
Thank you,
becomes
ma'am.
air, there is this yeah, Paul Kalanidhi, right? It's a wonderful book, and that breaks the barriers between science and poetry, science and art. Aditi Kakkad has given the author's second name, which I had missed. Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very
You're
much.
welcome, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am, for the talk. And guys, these are the talks for the tomorrow session. Please do join us for the tomorrow session at sharply at 4 p.m. And I guess we can conclude the meeting right now. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you all.